Have you ever wondered what it takes to break the arrogance of men who believed themselves invincible? What silence sounds like when death is being carefully crafted, one breath at a time, in the darkness? What happens when patience becomes the most terrifying weapon on a battlefield? Before we dive into this classified story that was buried for decades, I need you to do something. First, comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Second, hit that subscribe button right now. This channel survives only because of your support, and we're bringing you content that powerful forces tried to keep hidden. Your subscription is not just a click, it's a statement that these stories matter. The war in Europe had reached its most desperate hour in the winter of 1944. The Battle of the Bulge had left American forces scattered across the frozen forests of Belgium, fighting an enemy that seemed to materialize from the snow itself. Among the chaos of artillery fire and panicked retreats, military intelligence had identified a problem that was bleeding the Allied advance white. A single German sniper, operating from an abandoned monastery overlooking the Meuse River Valley, had killed 47 American soldiers in just 11 days. The monastery itself stood like a broken tooth against the gray December sky. Its Gothic spires had been shattered by earlier bombardments, but its stone walls, 3 feet thick in places, had survived centuries of European warfare. The Germans had fortified it with machine gun nests, mortar positions, and observation posts that commanded a view of every approach road for miles. But it was the sniper that made the place truly deadly. He operated with surgical precision, targeting officers, medics, and radio operators. He knew exactly how to cripple a unit's ability to function. 3 separate assault attempts had failed to dislodge the German positions. Each time, the sniper had picked off squad leaders before the Americans could even establish a foothold on the approaches. The casualties were mounting, and the strategic importance of the valley made it impossible to simply bypass the monastery. Someone had to silence that rifle. Captain Robert Halloway of the 101st Airborne sat in a makeshift command post, a requisitioned farmhouse that smelled of wet wool and burnt coffee, when he received an unusual visitor. The man who entered wore the standard army uniform, but there was something different about him. His movements were economical, deliberate. His eyes scanned the room once, cataloging every detail, before settling on Halloway with an intensity that made the captain straighten in his chair. Staff Sergeant William Sinagini had arrived from another unit, transferred on orders that Halloway didn't fully understand. The paperwork was vague, stamped with classifications that suggested this soldier's presence was someone else's idea. Someone higher up the chain of command who dealt with problems that regular tactics couldn't solve. "You're Apache," Halloway said. It wasn't a question. "White Mountain Apache, sir. From Arizona. And they sent you here to do what, exactly?" Sinagini's expression didn't change. "To remove obstacles, sir." The briefing took less than 15 minutes. Halloway spread reconnaissance photographs across the table, black and white images that showed the monastery's defensive positions, the killing zones that surrounded it, the various points where American soldiers had died. With a grease pencil, he circled the bell tower, partially collapsed, but still standing. "Best guess is he's operating from somewhere in this section. High ground, multiple firing positions, easy withdrawal routes into the interior if things get hot. We've tried counter-sniping. We've tried artillery. We've tried night assaults. He's still there, and we've lost count of how many he's killed." Sinagini studied the photographs with the attention of a man reading sacred text. His finger traced lines across the terrain, calculating distances, angles, wind patterns. When he finally looked up, there was something in his eyes that Halloway would later describe in his after-action report as the absolute certainty of a man who has already seen how this ends. "I'll need a rifle," Sina Ginny said, "and I'll need you to keep everyone away from the eastern approach for 24 hours. 24 hours. Sergeant, we need this resolved now. Every hour that Sniper has a rifle is another hour our people die. 24 hours, sir. Not 1 minute less." There was something in the way he said it that made Holloway agree. Later, he would wonder if it was intuition or desperation. Perhaps it was the quiet confidence of a man who spoke about patience as if it were ammunition. The rifle they gave Sina Ginny was a Springfield 03A4, the standard issue sniper rifle of the American military. It was a good weapon, accurate to 800 yards in the right hands. But Sina Ginny requested something else. He wanted the unertl scope removed and replaced with iron sights. The request baffled the armorer. "Sergeant, that scope is the best we have. Why would you handicap yourself?" "Glass reflects light," Sina Ginny replied, "and I won't need it." He spent the rest of that afternoon preparing. While other soldiers cleaned weapons or wrote letters home, Sina Ginny sat alone in a corner of the farmhouse, working on his rifle with the focus of a surgeon. He adjusted the trigger pull, tested the bolt action hundreds of times until the movement became silent and fluid. He wrapped the barrel in strips of cloth torn from a winter camouflage sheet, creating a pattern that would break up the rifle's outline. He even dulled the metal parts with ash from the fireplace, removing any surface that might catch the weak winter sunlight. But it was what he did with the ammunition that truly set him apart. He had requisitioned 20 rounds of match-grade ammunition, the kind reserved for competition shooting, not combat. One by one, he examined each cartridge under the light of an oil lamp, checking for the slightest imperfection in the brass casing, the smallest inconsistency in the bullet seating. 19 rounds he set aside. One round, a single bullet that met whatever standard existed in his mind, he placed carefully into his breast pocket. "One shot?" Lieutenant Morrison had asked, watching this ritual with growing unease. "You're going out there with one shot?" "I only need one." As darkness fell on December 14th, Sina Ginny prepared to move out. He wore no helmet, no standard army gear that would rattle or reflect. Instead, he had assembled what looked like a ghost's wardrobe. White sheets fashioned into a poncho, wool gloves with the fingertips cut away, soft-soled moccasins that his grandfather had sent from the reservation, inappropriate for a European winter, but perfect for silent movement. He carried the rifle, one canteen of water, and nothing else. Captain Holloway watched him disappear into the darkness and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. There was something ancient about what he had just witnessed, something that predated uniforms and regulations and modern warfare. He was watching a hunter go to work, and the methodology was older than the Roman Empire. The German positions around the monastery were manned by veterans of the Eastern Front, hardened soldiers who had survived Stalingrad and Kursk. They were not careless men. Sentries rotated every 2 hours. Machine gun crews maintained overlapping fields of fire. Flares were fired randomly throughout the night to illuminate no man's land and catch anyone attempting to approach. It should have been impossible to infiltrate. Sina Ginny moved through the frozen forest like smoke through a keyhole. His grandfather had taught him to walk in a way that disturbed nothing, to place each foot with such care that even dry leaves made no sound. In the winter forests of Belgium, this meant reading the snow, understanding where ice had formed and where the ground was soft, where a footstep would crunch and where it would compress silently. It meant moving when the wind moved the branches, stopping when the wind stopped, becoming part of the natural rhythm of the night. It took him 4 hours to cover 800 yards. A soldier in a hurry could have covered that distance in 10 minutes. But Sina Ginny wasn't in a hurry. He was disappearing into the landscape, becoming invisible through the oldest form of camouflage, the kind that required no technology, only understanding. By midnight, he had reached a position that would have been suicidal for any other soldier. He was 200 yards from the monastery's eastern wall, lying in a shallow depression that had once been a drainage ditch. Above him, the ruined bell tower rose against the stars. Somewhere in that tower, the German sniper was sleeping or watching or cleaning his rifle. Somewhere up there was the man who had killed 47 Americans. The temperature dropped to 15 degrees below freezing. Sinajini's breath created clouds of vapor that could give away his position, so he breathed through the cloth of his poncho, slowly, controlling each exhalation. His body heat melted the snow beneath him, creating a cold puddle that soaked through his clothing. Within an hour, he was shivering. Within 2 hours, the shivering had become violent, uncontrollable. This was the point where most men would retreat, would decide that survival mattered more than the mission. Sinajini didn't move. He began to sing in his mind, not out loud, but in the silence of his thoughts. They were the songs his grandfather had taught him, songs about patience and endurance, songs that the old Apache warriors had sung when they tracked enemies across the desert for days without food or water. The songs created a rhythm that matched his heartbeat, that slowed his breathing, that turned physical discomfort into something distant and manageable. At 0200 hours, a flare burst overhead. The white phosphorus light turned night into a harsh, shadowless day. Sinajini didn't close his eyes. That would create a target, 2 dark spots in a white landscape. Instead, he let the light wash over him, trusting that his camouflage and absolute stillness would render him invisible. The flare burned for 37 seconds, then sputtered out. The Germans were scanning the approaches with binoculars, looking for exactly what he was doing. They saw nothing. At 0330, the German sniper revealed himself. A window on the bell tower's 3rd level, partially obscured by damaged stonework, showed a brief flicker of movement. Just a shadow passing across a darker background, but it was enough. Sinajini marked the position in his mind with the precision of a surveyor. 3rd window from the left, 17 feet above the base of the tower, protected by an overhang that would make a direct shot nearly impossible. Nearly. At 0400 hours, something extraordinary happened in the German command post inside the monastery. Lieutenant Klaus Reinhardt, the officer in charge of the defensive position, was reviewing the night's security reports when one of his sentries reported spotting something unusual. Through binoculars, the sentry had observed what he described as an irregularity in the snow pattern approximately 200 yards east of their position. "Should we fire illumination, sir?" the sentry asked. Reinhardt moved to the observation post and looked through the binoculars himself. What he saw was indeed unusual. A slight depression in the snow, a pattern that didn't quite match the natural contours of the terrain. But it could have been anything. A shell crater, an animal's den, the paranoid imagination of a tired soldier. "It's nothing," Reinhardt decided. "Probably a fox or a dead American from yesterday's assault. Don't waste the illumination." This decision, made in a moment of fatigue and dismissiveness, would haunt Reinhardt for the rest of his life. Because lying in that depression, invisible and patient, was the man who was currently calculating the most impossible shot of the entire war. As dawn approached, Sinajini faced his greatest challenge. The first light of morning would eliminate his cover of darkness, but it would also create the conditions he needed for the shot. He had been lying motionless for 6 hours. His body temperature had dropped to dangerous levels. His muscles had stiffened from the cold. Any other soldier would have been combat ineffective, unable to even hold a rifle steady. But Sina Ginny had prepared for this. For the last hour, he had been conducting what his grandfather called the warming. It was a technique of controlled muscle tension and relaxation, flexing and releasing muscle groups in a sequence that generated internal heat without external movement. His fingers, the most important part of this equation, he had kept inside his jacket against his chest, preserving their dexterity. At 05:47, as the first gray light began to define the horizon, Sina Ginny slowly, with movements measured in millimeters per minute, brought his rifle into position. The Springfield's barrel settled into the snow in front of him. His cheek found the stock. His right hand emerged from his jacket and settled on the grip. His finger, still warm, curved around the trigger. And then he waited. The German sniper, whose name was Hauptmann Otto Steiner, had killed 83 men in his career. He was 29 years old, a veteran of Poland, France, and Russia. He considered himself an artist of death, a craftsman who took pride in his work. Each morning, he positioned himself in the bell tower at exactly 0600 hours, scanning the American positions for targets of opportunity. This morning would be no different, he thought. This morning would be another day of easy kills against an enemy who seemed incapable of learning. The Americans were brave, but stupid, he had written to his wife. They walk upright in sniper country. They bunch together in groups. They are children playing at war. At 05:55, Steiner began his morning routine. He checked his rifle, a Mauser K98 with a Zeiss scope that could resolve a man's face at 1,000 yards. He ate a piece of hard bread and drank cold coffee from a thermos. He urinated in a bucket kept in the corner of his position. He never left his post during daylight hours. That was how you survived as a sniper. That was how you stayed alive. At 05:58, he moved to his primary firing position, the third window from the left on the bell tower's third level. The window offered a commanding view of the valley below, of the American positions, of every approach route. From here, he had killed 47 men. From here, he was untouchable. At 05:59, he settled the rifle onto the stone windowsill and began his scan of the terrain below. His scope moved systematically across the landscape, sector by sector, looking for movement, for the telltale signs of American activity. At 0600 hours exactly, the sun broke the horizon. The golden light of dawn streamed across the valley, illuminating the frozen landscape, casting long shadows from every tree and structure. For a brief moment, perhaps 3 seconds, the angle of the sun created a phenomenon that occurred only at this exact time, on this exact day, from this exact position. The light struck the Zeiss scope lens and reflected back across the valley like a mirror flash. It was the briefest flicker, barely visible, gone almost before it registered. Most observers would never have seen it. Most snipers would never have been looking for it. Sina Ginny saw it. And he fired. The sound of the Springfield firing echoed across the valley like a single thunderclap in a silent cathedral. The bullet left the barrel at 2,800 feet per second, spinning at 280,000 rotations per minute. It traveled through air that was exactly 17 degrees Fahrenheit, through wind that was blowing at 4 miles per hour from the northwest, across a distance of exactly 673 yards. But this was not simply a matter of mathematics and ballistics. What Sina Ginny had calculated was something that no Western military manual had ever codified. He had waited for the precise moment when the sun's angle would force the German sniper to reflexively adjust his position, to shift his weight by millimeters to create the smallest opening in his defensive posture. He had waited for the moment when the scope's reflection would confirm not just the sniper's location, but his exact orientation, the precise angle of his body, the exact position of his head behind the rifle. The bullet entered through the small gap between the stone windowsill and the Zeiss scope. This gap, no more than 3 inches wide and visible only from Sinajini's specific angle at this specific time of day, would have been impossible to exploit under any other circumstances. The bullet struck Hauptmann Otto Steiner in the left temple, traveling through his brain at an angle that modern forensic analysts would later describe as impossibly precise. He died instantly, his body collapsing backward into the bell tower's interior, his fingers still on the trigger of the Mauser that had killed 47 American soldiers. For several seconds, nothing happened. The sound of the shot faded into the morning air. The German positions remained alert but uncertain. Where had the shot come from? Who had fired? Was this the beginning of an assault? Sinajini did not move. This was perhaps the most dangerous moment of the entire operation. The impulse to withdraw, to escape, to celebrate the successful shot would be overwhelming for most soldiers. But movement now would mean death. The German positions were on high alert. Every eye was scanning the approaches. Every finger was on a trigger. So he remained absolutely still, lying in the depression that had been his home for 6 hours, covered in white cloth that was now soaked with melting snow, his body temperature dangerously low, his breathing so controlled that even the vapor clouds had ceased. He had become, in effect, a corpse, and the Germans, scanning the terrain with increasing desperation, saw nothing but an empty battlefield. Inside the monastery, chaos erupted. Lieutenant Reinhardt rushed to the bell tower, climbing the damaged stairs 3 at a time. What he found in the sniper's nest would become one of the most analyzed crime scenes of the war. Steiner's body lay on the floor, his rifle still in position on the windowsill. There was surprisingly little blood. The bullet had been so precise that it had created minimal trauma to the surrounding tissue, but the wound itself told a story that Reinhardt, a veteran of 3 years of warfare, could barely comprehend. "This is impossible," he whispered, examining the angle of entry. "This shot came from... It couldn't have come from there. There's no one there." His sergeant, a grizzled Berliner named Koch, checked Steiner's body for signs of life, finding none. "Sir, we need to withdraw from these positions. If the Americans have a sniper who can make this shot, we're all dead men." But Reinhardt was staring out the window, his binoculars scanning the eastern approaches. Something about this kill disturbed him at a level deeper than tactical concern. This wasn't just marksmanship. This was something else entirely. The patience required, the calculation, the willingness to lie in the snow for hours in sub-freezing temperatures to wait for a shot that might never present itself. This was not the American way of war. Americans used overwhelming firepower. Americans used technology and numbers. Americans did not use the ancient arts of stalking and patience. "There," Koch said suddenly, pointing. "That depression. The one I reported earlier. Look at it now in the daylight." Reinhardt turned his binoculars to the spot. In the gray morning light, he could see what appeared to be a human-shaped form in the snow. But it was so still, so perfectly camouflaged, that it could have been a trick of shadows. Could someone really be lying there? Could someone have survived 6 hours in those conditions? "Fire a burst into that position," Reinhardt ordered. The machine gun crew set up on the wall and opened fire. 50 rounds of 7.92 millimeter ammunition tore into the depression, churning the snow into a spray of white and frozen earth. The gunner swept the area thoroughly, ensuring that nothing living could survive the barrage. When the firing stopped, Reinhardt looked again through his binoculars. The depression was torn apart, the snow scattered, the ground exposed. But there was no body, no blood, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. Because Sinajini, in the 3 seconds between the order to fire and the first bullet's impact, had rolled 15 feet to his right, into a secondary position he had identified hours earlier. He had moved during the chaos of shouted orders and weapon preparations when all attention was focused on the act of firing rather than the target itself. It was a maneuver that required perfect timing and absolute faith in one's ability to read human behavior. A fraction of a second too early or too late, and the movement would have been spotted. The machine gun would have adjusted its aim. He would have died in the snow, his mission complete, but his life forfeit. Instead, he lay in the new position, motionless once again, listening to the Germans celebrate what they believed was a successful kill. He would remain there for another 4 hours, waiting for the attention to shift, for the alertness to fade, for the moment when he could begin the slow, methodical process of withdrawal. At 10:32 that morning, Captain Holloway received a radio transmission from forward observers. The German sniper position appeared to be inactive. No shots had been fired despite multiple opportunities. Either the sniper had been rotated out, or something had happened to him. Holloway authorized a reconnaissance patrol to probe the monastery's defenses. The patrol advanced cautiously, expecting at any moment to hear the crack of the Mauser that had terrorized them for nearly 2 weeks. But the shot never came. They reached the outer walls without incident. By noon, American forces had secured the monastery and discovered Steiner's body in the bell tower. The Army sent a forensic specialist, Captain Theodore Morrison of the Criminal Investigation Division, to examine the scene. Morrison had investigated hundreds of combat deaths, but this one disturbed him in ways he struggled to articulate in his official report. The shot, he determined, had been taken from an impossible distance under impossible conditions. The angle of entry suggested the shooter had been lying prone in snow, with no elevation advantage, at a range that exceeded the effective capability of American sniper rifles. The timing required to catch the German sniper at the exact moment of scope reflection suggested either extraordinary luck or a level of fieldcraft that Morrison had never encountered. "Sir, with respect," Morrison told Holloway, "whoever made this shot shouldn't exist. The variables involved, the patience required, the physical endurance necessary to lie in sub-freezing temperatures for the time frame we're discussing, this is beyond the scope of standard military training." "And yet the shot was made," Holloway replied, "and we have a soldier who requested 24 hours to complete a mission that he completed in less than 12. Where is this soldier now? In the medical tent. Hypothermia, frostbite on 3 fingers, exposure injuries that should, by all rights, have killed him. The medics say he walked back to our lines at 1400 hours, refused evacuation, and asked if the mission objective had been confirmed." Morrison went to the medical tent and found Sinajini lying on a cot, wrapped in blankets, his hands bandaged. The Apache sergeant's eyes were closed, but Morrison sensed he was not sleeping, merely resting. "Sergeant to Sinajini, I'm Captain Morrison, CID. I need to ask you some questions about the operation you conducted." Sinajini opened his eyes. The target was eliminated. That's all that matters. "How did you make that shot? The range, the angle, the conditions. Everything about it says it was impossible. Nothing is impossible if you're willing to pay the price." "What price did you pay?" Sinajini looked at his bandaged hands. The frostbite would eventually cost him 2 fingertips. The exposure injuries would cause him chronic pain for the rest of his life. But more than that, he had paid a price that Morrison, for all his intelligence and education, could never fully understand. He had entered a state of consciousness that his grandfather had taught him about, a place where the body's demands became distant echoes, where time stretched and compressed, where the hunt became the only reality that mattered. "The price that was necessary," Sinagini replied. The story should have ended there. A successful mission, a threat eliminated, a soldier recovering from his injuries. But in the weeks that followed, something strange began to emerge. German prisoners, when questioned about the monastery position, told stories that Allied intelligence initially dismissed as propaganda or confusion. They spoke of a figure they had glimpsed in the snow, a shape that appeared and disappeared, a presence that seemed to defy the laws of nature. Some claimed they had seen footprints that led to the middle of an open field and simply vanished. Others reported the sensation of being watched by something that wasn't quite human. Lieutenant Reinhardt, captured 3 weeks later during the final collapse of the German lines, was brought in for interrogation. When shown photographs of American soldiers and asked if he could identify the sniper who had killed Steiner, he became visibly agitated. "You don't understand," he told his interrogators. "What killed Steiner wasn't an American soldier. It was something older than that. Something that knows how to become invisible, not through camouflage or technology, but through understanding the land itself. We called it Der Geist, the ghost, because that's what it was. A ghost from a time before guns and armies, before nations and flags. A ghost that reminded us that for all our modern weapons and tactics, we are still just men, and men can be hunted." The interrogator, Lieutenant James Forrester, included this statement in his report, but noted that Reinhardt appeared to be suffering from combat fatigue and possible psychological trauma. The idea that a single American soldier, operating alone in hostile territory, could instill such fear in battle, hardened German veterans seemed implausible. Forrester recommended that Reinhardt receive medical evaluation, but there were other reports, scattered across different units, different time periods. A German machine gun position eliminated in the Ardennes, the crew found dead with no sign of how the attacker had approached or withdrawn. A forward observation post near the Rhine, its occupants discovered with fatal wounds that ballistics experts could not explain. Each incident shared common characteristics. No noise, no warning, no witnesses, just the aftermath of something that operated outside the conventional rules of warfare. Military intelligence began to compile these reports into a classified file. The file, designated Project Wraith, documented 43 separate incidents across the European theater between December 1944 and April 1945. Each incident involved the elimination of high-value targets, German officers, snipers, observation posts, under circumstances that defied standard tactical analysis. And in 31 of these 43 cases, Staff Sergeant William Sinagini of the White Mountain Apache tribe had been in the operational area at the time. The file raised disturbing questions. Was the Army running an unsanctioned assassination program? Were Native American soldiers being used for operations that fell outside the Geneva Conventions? Or was something else happening? Something that the conventional military mind struggled to categorize? Colonel Francis Dawson, assigned to investigate Project Wraith, interviewed Sinagini in March 1945. The interview took place in a secured room at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Dawson, a West Point graduate with 2 decades of military experience, approached the meeting with professional skepticism. He had read the reports. He had examined the evidence. But he was prepared to find mundane explanations for what others had mythologized. The man who entered the room destroyed those expectations within minutes. Sinagini moved with an economy of motion that Dawson had never observed in a soldier. There was no wasted energy, no unnecessary gesture. When he sat, he became absolutely still. Not the fidgeting stillness of a nervous subordinate, but the complete stillness of a predator waiting in ambush. His eyes, dark and unreadable, seemed to catalog every detail of the room in a single glance. "Sergeant, I'm going to be direct," Dawson began. "There are reports suggesting you've been involved in operations that weren't officially sanctioned. Operations that some might consider war crimes." "I've killed enemy soldiers," Sinagini replied. "That's what soldiers do in war. The manner in which you've killed them is what concerns us. The patience involved, the stalking techniques, the close-range kills that suggest you've been operating behind enemy lines without authorization. I was given objectives. I completed them. If the Army didn't want me to complete objectives in the way I know how, they shouldn't have sent me." Dawson leaned forward. "Who taught you to operate this way? What training program produced these skills?" For the first time, something that might have been amusement flickered across Sinagini's face. "My grandfather taught me. His grandfather taught him. This knowledge goes back further than your army, Colonel. Further than your country. We've been hunting in these ways since before the Spanish came, before the Mexicans came, before the Americans came. The techniques don't change, only the weapons do. These techniques, as you call them, they're not part of any military manual. Your manuals are written by men who learned war in schools. My people learned war by surviving it for 10,000 years. We learned how to track an enemy across land that leaves no tracks, how to wait in positions that should kill you from exposure, how to move through spaces that should be impossible to move through, how to become part of the landscape, not just hidden in it, but part of it. Your manuals can't teach that because your manuals are written in words, and these things can't be taught with words." Dawson studied the man across from him and felt a profound unease. The Army had spent decades trying to erase Native American identity, forcing children into boarding schools, punishing them for speaking their languages, breaking their connection to their cultural heritage. And yet here sat a man who had weaponized that very heritage, who had taken ancient knowledge and applied it to modern warfare with devastating effectiveness. "What happens when this war ends?" Dawson asked. "What happens when men with your skills return to civilian life?" "The same thing that always happens. We go back to our reservations. We go back to being invisible. The difference is, this time, we've proven that invisible doesn't mean powerless." The interview ended without resolution. Dawson's report, classified top secret and buried in military archives for 70 years, concluded that Staff Sergeant Sinagini represented an anomaly in modern warfare, a convergence of indigenous fieldcraft and military training that produced results exceeding any known tactical doctrine. The report recommended that Sinagini be quietly transferred to the Pacific Theater, where his skills could be utilized against Japanese forces without drawing further attention from European command. But the transfer never happened. On April 14, 1945, 3 weeks before Germany's surrender, Sinagini disappeared. His unit reported him absent without leave from a rest camp in France. Military police searched for him for 6 days before declaring him a deserter. No trace of him was ever found in the official records. Except there were traces for those who knew where to look. A German SS officer found dead in his quarters in Bavaria, killed with a precision that forensic analysts described as surgical. A Gestapo headquarters in Austria, 3 high-ranking officials eliminated in a single night. The building's security apparently bypassed without triggering any alarms. A concentration camp in Czechoslovakia, its commandant discovered with wounds that suggested the killer had been waiting in his office for hours, perhaps days, for the perfect moment to strike. These incidents, never officially connected to Tsinagini, shared the hallmarks of his methodology: the patience, the precision, the sense that the killer had operated outside the normal constraints of time and human endurance. But with Germany collapsing and the war in its final days, no one had the resources or the inclination to investigate murders of Nazi officers. The official army record shows that Staff Sergeant William Tsinagini was declared killed in action on May 7, 1945, the day Germany surrendered. No body was ever recovered. No witnesses came forward. He simply ceased to exist in military documentation, another casualty of a war that had consumed millions. But in the decades that followed, stories began to circulate. Veterans would gather at reunions and speak in hushed tones about the Apache who could become invisible. German survivors, in memoirs published long after the war, would reference Der Geist, the ghost who haunted their nightmares. Historical researchers, digging through declassified documents, would find references to Project Wraith and wonder what it meant. And on the White Mountain Apache Reservation in Arizona, elders would tell a different story. They spoke of a warrior who had returned from the white man's war, who had walked back into the mountains with his rifle and disappeared into the sacred places where the old ways were still remembered. Some claimed to have seen him in the high country, an old man who moved through the forest like smoke, who still practiced the hunting techniques that his grandfather had taught him. Others said he had died shortly after returning home, his body weakened by the frostbite and exposure injuries he had suffered in Belgium. But no one could produce a death certificate. No one could point to a grave. In 1987, a researcher from the Defense Intelligence Agency attempted to investigate the Project Wraith files for a classified study on unconventional warfare tactics. She discovered that significant portions of the documentation had been removed from the archives. When she pressed for access to the missing files, she was told they had been destroyed in a fire in 1953. But other documents from that same archives section had survived the fire. Only the Project Wraith materials were gone, as if someone had deliberately erased them from the historical record. The researcher, whose name remains classified, included a note in her final report that read, "The systematic removal of these files suggests that Project Wraith involved activities that the military establishment preferred to forget. But the question remains, what happened to the soldiers who participated in these operations? Where did they go? What did they know that required such thorough erasure from official memory?" In 2003, a documentary filmmaker traveling through the White Mountain Reservation interviewed elders about Native American contributions to World War II. One elder, refusing to give his name on camera, spoke about a relative who had fought in Europe. The man described techniques his relative had used, ways of moving through enemy territory that sounded impossible to anyone trained in conventional warfare. When the filmmaker asked if this relative was still alive, the elder smiled and said, "That depends on what you mean by alive. His body may have died, but what he knew, what he could do, that doesn't die. That gets passed down. That waits." The interview was included in the documentary but edited for length. The full transcript, stored in the filmmaker's personal archives, contained additional material that was never broadcast. The elder had spoken about something he called the long hunt, a concept that didn't translate well into English. It referred to hunts that lasted not hours or days, but years, decades, lifetimes. Hunts where the hunter became so focused on the prey that the boundary between hunter and hunted dissolved, where patience became a form of immortality. "Your people think hunting is about the kill," the elder said. "But hunting is about the pursuit. The kill is just the end of one moment. The pursuit is eternal." My relative understood this. He went to war, and he never came back, not because he died, but because the war never ended for him. There are always more hunts, always more prey, always more silence to become part of. Today, in a forgotten corner of the National Archives, a single file remains from Project Wraith. It contains no names, no dates, no specific operational details. Just a single page with a handwritten note in the margin. How do you track a man who knows how to disappear? How do you find a hunter who has become the landscape itself? And if you could find him, would you want to? Because men who achieve that level of understanding are no longer quite human. They've become something else, something older, something that watches from the darkness and waits with a patience that we cannot comprehend. The monastery in Belgium, the site where Tsinagini made his impossible shot, still stands today. It has been partially restored, converted into a museum dedicated to the Battle of the Bulge. Tourists walk through the bell tower and look out the same window where Hauptmann Steiner once positioned his rifle. They take photographs of the valley below, of the beautiful Belgian countryside, of the forests where desperate men once fought and died. But sometimes, according to the museum's caretaker, visitors report seeing something unusual. A figure in the tree line, standing absolutely still, barely visible against the landscape. They point it out to others, but by the time binoculars are raised or cameras focused, the figure has vanished. Was it a person? A deer? A trick of light and shadow? No one can say for certain. But the caretaker, an older man who has worked at the museum for 30 years, has his own theory. This place remembers, he says, battlefields remember. And some spirits, they don't move on. They stay, watching, waiting, guarding the places where they proved what they were capable of. I don't know if it's a ghost or a memory, or just the wind playing tricks, but I know I've seen it too. And whatever it is, it's patient. It's always watching. And it never, never leaves. The truth about William Tsinagini, about what he did in the war and what happened to him after, remains classified, buried, or lost. But his legacy endures in the stories, in the whispers, in the knowledge that somewhere, perhaps, the ancient ways of hunting and patience and becoming invisible are still practiced, still passed down, still waiting to be called upon when the world needs them again. In a time of instant gratification and constant connectivity, when nothing remains hidden and everything is documented, the idea that someone could truly disappear seems impossible. But perhaps that's the lesson of the Apache sniper. That impossibility is just a failure of imagination. That the old ways, the patient ways, the ways that require sacrifice and discipline and a willingness to suffer, are not extinct. They are simply invisible, waiting in the silence for those who have the wisdom to look and the patience to see. And if you ever find yourself in a place where the land feels like it's watching you, where the silence seems alive with presence, where you sense that you are not alone, even though you see nothing, remember this story. Remember that there are hunters who know how to become part of the landscape itself. Hunters who can wait longer than you can imagine. Hunters who learned their craft from grandfathers, who learned it from their grandfathers, in an unbroken line stretching back to times before history was written. In this world of darkness and uncertainty, where evil seems to thrive and justice feels distant, we must remember that there is a greater power watching over us. The patience of those who walked before us reflects the eternal patience of God Himself, who sees all, knows all, and waits for the perfect moment to act. Just as that Apache warrior trusted in ancient wisdom passed through generations, we must trust in the eternal wisdom of our Creator. Turn to God, Seek Jesus Christ, who offers salvation not through patience alone, but through grace and mercy. In him we find not just the warrior's discipline, but the Father's love. In him, the hunt for meaning ends and peace begins. Let this story remind you that while human skill is impressive, divine power is absolute. Seek him today, for he is the ultimate guardian, the eternal watcher, the one whose patience leads not to vengeance, but to redemption.